going to start with a very small and simple question, which is, what is Jewish responsibility? And what defines a Jewish issue vis-a-vis Jewish responsibility?
You know what you learn in Hebrew school? You learn the story about Abraham and breaking the idols, and God must have chosen him because it doesn't tell you why it's all of a sudden it says Lech Lecha that Abraham should go out into the broad world, and we don't know why. So the rabbis told us that it had to do with breaking the idols, and God perceived, and Abraham had the ability to perceive God where the other people around him were being pagans. And I'm kind of puzzled by that story because actually the Torah tells us explicitly why, God tells us explicitly why Abraham is chosen. It says, Ki yadativ l'man asher yitzaveh et banav et beito acharav v'shamru derech Hashem la'asot tzedakah u'mishpat l'man havia Avraham et asher aseh. So he says, let's see if I can translate it. I can. It says, God says, I picked him out so that he will command his children and everyone in his household to do God's way. And what is God's way? To do justice and righteousness. And on the basis of that, God is going to be able to allow Abraham to fulfill his destiny. That's our mission. It's explicit. It says directly in the Torah what we're supposed to do and what our mission, what is God's way, and it's to do tzedakah u'mishpat, to do justice and righteousness. What are the specifics of justice and righteousness? I think that you've got the next, it's a pretty fat book, the Bible. Trying to fill in the details, but the starting point of what is a Jewish issue is whatever is shamru derech Hashem, God's ways, is to do tzedakah u'mishpat, to do justice and righteousness, and in that sense, I think it's an incredibly broad range of dealing with iniquity in the world as a whole.
Yeah, I think just to maybe even emphasize that in a more basic formulation, human issues are Jewish issues. I think it's actually very important to kind of assert that. We can sometimes fall into a trap that's often born, I think, out of various anxieties that Jews have in modernity about surviving and thriving and preserving the parochial boundaries of the community, which are all really important, and a lot of those anxieties are well-founded. But we can tend to therefore think that the only things that are sort of ultimate Jewish importance are things that are not of importance to anyone else. And in a deep sense, right, human issues are Jewish issues because Jews are human beings and Jews are part of human society. And I think in other places where we can sort of understand the Torah sending us that message, first of all, the basic fact, which we all know, but I think we often underestimate the import of, the fact that the Torah begins with creation and not with Abraham. The fact that the Torah begins, and almost I wonder if the verse you're citing is like a reminder to us, don't think just because we've gotten into this parochial story now that we don't care about those general issues, but that we tell a story that begins with the creation of humanity. That itself tells us in a very deep way what the kind of scope of this revelation is about. And there's another verse in Deuteronomy in chapter 4 that imagines that when the Torah is properly enacted in the world, people of other nations will pick their heads up and say, Mi goy gadol asher lo chukim u'mishpatim tzadikim, look at this amazing nation that has such an incredible and righteous way of living. And the only way that's kind of intelligible is if there are things that are visible about the manifestation of Jewish commitments that are universally recognizable in some way. And that means Jews are playing out human issues in addition to Jewish ones. I think on the question of, so what is there any sense in which we can talk about something being a Jewish issue? So I'll add two components that feel important to me and that I actually think various efforts around social action and social justice in the Jewish community have tried to play out, but I think we could probably do even more work around this. One is, do we use a Jewish language around it? And as much as people knock, I've heard a lot of people in a lot of contexts knock a sort of superficial invoking of tikkun olam, and what does that mean? And it's just 2 words, and it doesn't mean anything. There's a lot more that should be said than just throwing out a catchphrase of tikkun olam. But the motivation to use a phrase like that, I actually think, comes from a very important place, which is there ought to be a Jewish way of speaking about the universal commitments that we hold. And I think as a general kind of rubric, a Jewish issue might be made Jewish by talking about it in ways that go deep. And even what we've just tried to do right now, can I quote you a verse? Can I give you an anchoring of this? I think goes a long way to that. The other thing I would suggest, which I think I'd really be interested to hear how other panelists think about this through their own work. To me, what's so striking about the Torah as a text is the kind of total intertwined nature, particularly in some of the legal code sections, of the parochial, the universal, the ethical, the ritual. There's sort of no separation of those into 2 completely separate realms. And I wonder if what also makes something a Jewish issue is whether we can also see the values intertwined into more parochial commitments as well. In other words, if you are fighting economic disadvantage and economic exploitation in the world, does that also kind of play out in your Shabbat practice in terms of understanding the role that Shabbat as a unique Jewish institution is supposed to play in terms of kind of managing, work and economics and all sorts of other things in a way that doesn't allow it just to sort of dissolve into that larger conversation. I'll leave it at that for now for some opening thoughts on that.
Okay. As you were both speaking, I realized that I kind of come at this from a very different angle, and I'm probably not going to quote much Torah to you all, but I'm just going to speak from the experience that I do have. I have the great privilege today to work in a human rights organization in Israel. We work with asylum seekers in Israel and migrants as well, and specifically we are talking about groups who are non-Jews in Israel. And we are an Israeli organization, we are a human rights organization, but I feel like I work in an extremely Jewish place. Our text, our underlying ideas, our written work on our website is Ki ga'aytem b'Mitzrayim, because we were strangers in Egypt. And that starts right at the source. And for me, it's been a very full circle. I visit immigration detention a lot. And visiting immigration detention is quite a difficult thing. There's a lot of people in jail treated like criminals who are not criminals. Jails are built to be a place of discipline and punishment. And it's become used a lot in migration as well, despite it not being actually a tool of punishment, because there is no crime. And today I visit detention somewhat regularly. But actually, the first time I visited immigration detention, I was 17 years old in Australia, and my rabbi took me there. And at the time, he used to go and visit refugees in detention every week, and I was very lucky that he took me one week. And it was a very defining experience for me to sit in front of people who were humble enough to talk about their own experience. Some people who were much more senior in life, I was very young at the time, who opened their hearts and shared the difficulties that they were experiencing. And for me, what made it extremely Jewish was that I was there with my rabbi. For me, that was a fundamental Jewish experience that I learned from the personal dugma, example in my rabbi, who I learned to see as a rabbi not just because it was a position, but because it was literally someone through his acts that I really looked up to. And it feels very full circle that now I'm in a similar position of going to detention. And one of the things that one of the refugees who I spoke to at that time when I was 17 was, he said to me, detention is a place where where you can lose hope. And having people like the rabbi who he had gotten to know gave him a lot of hope. He said, we don't have the same religion, but I can see he's a religious man and he understands me and he comes and he brings that. And I think that a lot of that is finding security and hope That's common in religion, and he was able to share that from a place of Judaism. And I think now in my life, when I go to immigration detention, it's certainly not our purpose there. We go there to provide legal aid, but it is a common theme that we have clients who say to us, even though there were times when you couldn't help me, knowing that there were people coming to visit us gave us a lot of hope. And for me, all of that is intertwined deeply with Judaism.
So thank you for these perspectives. I think we've sort of bridged an interesting gap here, right? We sort of saw the answer that you gave, Meesh, play out in what you heard from the people you were visiting. What makes it a Jewish issue? When we see righteousness and justice fulfilled, and when someone's life is improved, that makes it a Jewish issue. What makes it a Jewish issue? When there are human beings in front of us. But we know at the end of the day that the day is only so long. We can only accomplish so much in our lives. And so one question that comes is, how do we prioritize? Do we put Jews who are in need ahead of non-Jews who are in need? You know, within the many, many communities in the world that are in need, how do we prioritize? And does Jewish text guide us in some way in prioritizing?
Yeah, I think this is, this is an issue that has been struggled with for a long time. I want to offer maybe two competing texts or perspectives, and maybe offer actually a shared idea that might lie behind them. One of them, which is a topic I taught about earlier in the conference, which is this biblical character of the ger, the biblical character of the non-Israelite resident of Israelite, not Israeli, though maybe also Israelite society, of someone who's not of the dominant group, not of the ruling class, not the person for whom the society was set up, but who is very much present there. And one of the things that's very striking about the Torah's approach to that character is, though the Torah is aware that the normal course of affairs would be that that person is marginalized, is not your priority, is second class, the Torah repeatedly says, no, mishpat echad yihyeh lager la'ezrach, there is one rule that applies to that person and to the native-born, or what we might call the citizen. That's one text, which seems like very clearly you're responsible for everyone, right? Sort of broadly speaking. The other text, also, pretty well known, is one that's trying to think about the sort of various boundaries of geography and in-group and out-group, and is picking up on a verse that talks about he'ani imach, the poor who is in your midst. And the hierarchies that are sort of played out there are, well, if it's a Jew and a Gentile, then the Jew takes precedence, because it's im kesef talvet ami, when you lend someone from my nation. So my nation, the Jews are going to take precedence over the Gentiles. And then the notion of the ani imach, the poor who are with you, indicates that the poor of your own town come before the poor far away. And that's a very different kind of message, in the sense that it seems to be saying, no, what you actually got to think about is what is the most local definition of sort of self and responsibility that you begin with, and then you work out from there. What I would suggest, though, that's actually in common with both of those texts, it's just they're sort of talking about different contexts, is the frame of power, which is to say, it is power, I think, ultimately, that begets responsibility. The more power you have over someone, the more responsibility you have for them. So when the Torah is talking about a sovereign Israelite kingdom, society, writ large, it's very clear to the Torah that there's no meaning of controlling a people without also taking care of them. Those just have to go hand in hand. And we can think about that more broadly in terms of any society and what its responsibility is to everyone who lives there on some level. I think the rabbinic texts that talk about the difference between in and out and farther out is playing in a different realm, I think both historically and conceptually, where it's assumed that Jews don't have any power over the Gentiles in that text, and therefore an act of generosity or charity towards the Gentiles is a sort of gratuitous spending of extra funds in a way that is inappropriate before you've taken care of the people who are not just in your in-group, but in your city where you actually run the affairs. I think one of the things that's really challenging here, speaking personally, I think I find this exhausting sometimes, is when you are a citizen of the wealthiest and most powerful country on earth, and you have information that pours in about crises, humanitarian and otherwise, from all over the globe, it kind of feels like you have power and potential influence over everyone. And this is where we get plunged into this question of people feeling like, I don't even know what to do about this. I think, though, we have to sort of find a way to anchor ourselves back in that notion of, can I ask myself, okay, who do I really have sort of influence over? Where can I really make an impact? And there's some fusion, I think, between being conscious to that sort of difference between local and more distant, but without falling into the trap of Jew or non-Jew is ipso facto like the necessary line that you always draw if you're dealing with a situation where the kind of power you exert or the influence you have doesn't actually respect those lines. Even as there's clearly a lot of practical questions. I have some other thoughts, but I'll stop there and maybe we'll come back to them in the next round.
For me, in the last few years in the work that I do, the kind of Jewish source that continually comes back to me is from Pirkei Avot, where it speaks about that the responsibility to finish the work of perfecting the world is not on you, but neither are you free to desist from it. And I think that sits at the heart of this, that this idea of, oh, there's so much, is not an excuse. It's not a way to run away, but should actually be a point of engagement. But this question of what do we prioritize, it's a very theoretical question, and I think in practice, it's not really a real dichotomy. It's not really a real conflict, because so much of the time when we are engaging with, I don't know, a disadvantaged or a vulnerable population, there is what we are giving, but there is also so much more that we are receiving. And it makes me think of a text that really stuck with me for many years from a socialist Zionist leader to Benken, and he's talking about the hakshara of people from Eastern Europe who are preparing to go to Israel and to work the land. And they have this farm and they're carving stones. They're learning to be laborers. And he writes about carving the stone to carve themselves. And really, I think about all of the times in my life where I've had the opportunity to engage with kind of service work. And I do think that for us, it's less about, not always about Judaism inspiring that work, but also us learning Judaism from it. And I'm not sure that dividing it and seeing it as one or another, such as, prioritizing Jewish problems or Jewish community over another, is necessarily the right lens or the best way to look at it. I think there can be a much more complicated view and understanding of it.
I certainly couldn't disagree with anything that they've said so far. But I'll see if I can add first I think, all right, let me start with this. The Ben Azai, there's a Talmudic sage, his name is Ben Azai, and he articulates, there's a discussion about the commandment to reproduce. And he says, whoever doesn't have children is shofech damim and mima'et b'dmut Hashem. He is committing murder and reducing the amount of God in the world. And the rabbis turned to him and what are you talking about? You're not even married. Yesh yafeh, yesh na'eh doresh v'na'eh mekayem, v'ata na'eh doresh v'enatan na'eh mekayem. You speak a really great talk, but you don't walk the walk. And his answer, I think, is very profound. He says, Ma ni'aseh, nafshi chashka b'torah. I'm devoted totally to Torah. אבל יתקיים העולם על ידי אחר. Somebody else will do that work. And it's not to like give you an excuse actually, because at Pardes community engagement, we have, Pardes is a non-coercive institution. It's like a sort of crazy, ridiculous way to define yourself as non-coercive. And we defined ourselves that way before there was Yeshivat Hadar. It was like that we chose that for ourselves. But but we have compulsory volunteer work, okay, community engagement every week. So I think that you have to do something. But whatever you do is great. So Ben Azai can set up this hierarchy that really the ideal thing to do is to be engaged in having children, but not everyone is suited for that. Wouldn't it have been tragic if Einstein would have dedicated his time to good works and gone to the nursing home every week? I think he was actually a really nice guy. But never mind. His time was best spent doing the things that he did best. And when my students come, one of the hats that I wear at Pardes is being the gesher for that weekly community engagement project. And when students say, but I want to do something that's like really needed and it's not, like how can I it doesn't feel like enough to do whatever project it is that they feel like they're going to do. I'm always reorienting them to just think about what it is that you'll be able to be passionate about, that you'll be able to do in a sustained way, because actually, in truth, continuing to give over time is not easy. And if it's something that you're passionate about and you do well, there's so much need in the world. I don't think that we need to set priorities. That being said, I think in my life, I understand the principle, Aniyeh Ircha Kodem. And I live in Jerusalem, and I sort of think if we have to correct somewhere in the world, right, like, I love to go to the nursing home and sing, and I really love working with elderly, but I make sure that a large proportion of my of both my chesed and my activism is connected to non-Jews particularly, not because I disagree with Aniyeh Ircha Kodem, but because I think that the pendulum in our country has swung to a place that I want to try to balance it out. And my passions are there naturally, but I think also my skills contribute to there. And then I said, so I think I'm agreeing with Tamara that like there's no need to set priorities, but rather to pick the thing that you are good at and do it, and don't get caught up with what a waste of energy to think, is this the most important? Probably. Did anyone spend some time, or am I the only one that like went to a session and thought, should I have got a few times I'm going to a session and I'm like, should I going to go to this one? Am I going to go to that one? Am I going to go to that one? And then I wasted the first 15 minutes of the session thinking, am I in the right session? Am I in the right session? Don't waste your time on that. Just go to a community engagement project, build a relationship, pick a tzedakah, give to it, and make an impact.
So I think this actually leads us to a next interesting question in some ways, which is, what do we do when our personal compulsions are in tension with what the texts are telling us? So if we interpret the text as saying, actually, you should be more concerned about the Jews in your own neighborhood, but your inclination is, but the pendulum has swung a certain way in my country and where I can make a bigger difference, how do you, within a halachic framework, or does it need to be within a halachic framework even? When do we get to step outside of that framework? How do we deal with those tensions in a way that's both authentic to us and authentic to Jewish tradition as practitioners of Jewish tradition?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I want to say first one thing about the pendulum and that I didn't respond to you can't disagree with Aniyei Ircha Kodem, but you can supplement it with additional sources, and I don't think anybody would disagree with me either. The Chatam Sofer cites the Sifrei says, Ta'av Ta'av Kodem, right? In the context, there's a big machloket, a huge disagreement about how do we, Aniyei Ircha Kodem, what does that mean that the poor of my city come first? Both the Chatam Sofer, and I think maybe it will be easier now, more direct for me to cite the Pirchei Tshuva, that what that means is not that all of the needs of my family come first, and then after everyone is taken care of, then I turn to those who are outside of me. But the Pirchei Tshuva suggests we should think about it this way. First, I think I said this already to some people. Okay, but it's so profound and so we should and it's not the only interpretation of this. But one interpretation is that everyone gets a piece of bread, right? At first, the first people that get a piece of bread are the people in my family. Then everyone in my city gets a piece of bread, and then everyone in the city gets a piece of bread, and so on until everyone in the world has a piece of bread, and then everyone gets a carrot. Chocolate milk at the end this time. Okay, so so that's not to disagree. All right, all of that is also not to that doesn't answer your question at all. I just was supplement my previous. How do we feel about? So now back to the question of what happens when there's tension between what we see as the simple reading of Jewish texts and Jewish morals, or our autonomous ethic. Let's put it this way. Tomorrow I'm teaching Daf Yomi. So it's a great daf. The Tosafists are having a hard time with the daf. But over and over again, the daf is a tough daf for them, and they just are interpreting the daf in light of their life experience in a way that is constantly informed, but always informed by other texts, because I don't think it's really anyone who tells you there's a Jewish value Judaism says is obviously wrong. Judaism has competing values, and over the course of Jewish history and situations, you'll give different valence to those different values, and sometimes you find yourself coming against something that feels problematic, and it needs to be interpreted in light of other sources. And I think that that's got the Yerushalmi says if the Torah would have been given chatuchot, if it would have been given clear cut, there would be no place to stand, right? And what that means is God gave us the Torah. God gave us a written Torah and an oral Torah on purpose so that we could continue to interpret and that is Torah.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add that I think, I think when we encounter texts that are difficult or counterintuitive to how we may think, if we're actually encountering them, right, which is probably a small set of people who are actually going through a process of trying to figure out, should I be this way or should I be that way? I think most people more or less have a pattern, particularly on these issues, of what they do, right? There's some people who I think sit down, and when they go through their end of year tzedakah calculations, they've got some percentage they want to hit or don't want to hit on parochial or universal levels, and that's probably what they do. But if we're talking about the subset of people who are thinking about that, which I think is certainly the people in this room and beyond, I think you want to try to be in a place of a kind of reciprocal process with the text. Where I think actually the first thing, which can be really hard, but I think you want to be open to, is allowing the text to correct your initial instinct. That is to say, if you come across a text that feels more parochial than your universal instinct would otherwise, push you to arrive at that conclusion, I think at least the first step you want to say is, have I not thought this all the way through? Right? Is there actually a kind of responsibility here to people who are closer into me that I am overlooking? And I am jumping to be a universalist in a way that is inappropriate. And here I will say, I actually think a number of those parochial texts can be a very important corrective to the flood of external information and distraction that we get around, tragedy all over the world. I think about it, that it is a strange condition that many of us are in. Or speaking for myself, there are many mornings where I check nytimes.com before I have checked how my children are doing. I don't think that's really a good state of affairs, right? And I suspect I'm not alone. You get up, the kid's not quite up, or whatever it is, but there's a sort of, you can very easily in our world come to a place where your first instinct is, well, let me get the biggest picture possible. And meantime, there could be someone like living in your house who is not feeling well, who you didn't rush to sort of attend or say, what's the chesed that I could do, the kindness that I could display to this person right here. And there's, less extreme forms of that, but I think there actually is something to be listened to. That text may be waking up and say, hey, don't go out into some imagined other world that you're now gonna, think about, et cetera, and try to figure out how you can make a difference. There may be a lot of other circles where people are counting on you. You're the only person they can really count on. How do you step into that? I think that's actually a really important first step, to be open to being molded by the text. Now, I think once you do that, and there's still way more bandwidth to do all kinds of other things, and also there are some things about the text that may strike you as off, like, really, the line runs between Jew and Gentile? That's the key line? Or the line runs in such a clear way through geographic proximity, when it could be that in terms of trade routes and economic influence and any number of things, like my chocolate bar ties me more directly to some place in Africa, South America, than, quite frankly, it does to some town in America, 30 miles west on a not well-traveled road what I really have no connection with. That's where I think the kinds of sort of searching for, I think you just modeled one bit of it. What other things in the tradition have already complicated this text? And also, what do the terms even mean, right? I don't think you can pluck a text that draws a line between Jew and Gentile from the Roman Empire and the state of affairs between Jews and Gentiles in that world and apply it to refugees living under an Israeli Jewish government. And that's where you actually have to start to ask yourself, the word nochri, foreigner, is being used here, but what does it mean? Does it mean a barbarian? Does it mean someone who just happens not to have a Jewish mother? Does it mean someone who has power over me? And that's where actually I think it's not necessarily you against the tradition, it's you trying to actually go deep in to the tradition and to the text and understand it and ask yourself, what I think is the difficult but not impossible question. Can I get to a deeper understanding of this text and invite the author of this text into the room with me and say, well, how would they answer this question? There's always going to be some degree, that's standing in front of me. There's always going to be some degree of speculation, and I think if you do that from within a broader tradition of interpretation, you have a lot of other friends and allies who are helping you with that reading. But that's in general, writ large, but certainly I think in this context, the kind of reciprocal process, what does the text have to teach me and sort of correct in my instinct? And then what about my instincts just hasn't yet been effectively rendered into the language of the text, such that ideally at the end, it's not about who's going to win, me or the text, but we've come to a place where my insights and the text insights somehow create a kind of unified worldview and mission and direction for action.
So Tamara, I want to ask you a specific question because I think both of you have picked up on the idea that we have to sort of redefine the terms for ourselves in this debate. So I'm interested to hear a little bit about how this whole conversation and even the categories that we're creating right now shift in an Israeli context, right? Is the conversation about social justice even a conversation in Israel? What is a humanitarian issue versus a social justice issue? And how do the definitions of those categories perhaps get turned on their heads in an Israeli context?
So it's a very good question because I told Rachel when we spoke on the phone, in the preparation for this panel that I suddenly, I was sitting in my office in Tel Aviv. You can probably hear from my accent, I'm not a Sabra Israeli, I'm Australian originally. And for those few moments we were on the phone, I suddenly felt like I was transported out of Israel, and I had stepped into an entirely different discourse of diaspora Judaism. And it was a very nice, comfortable, lovely return, and it made me really excited to come to Limmud and be in that environment, because it is the world that I grew up in, but it is starkly different to the conversation going on in Israel. The world that I move in, I'll say, is very universalist. It's very human rights oriented. Our texts are not necessarily the Torah, but more like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Refugee Convention, and they're very much our texts. But I'm of the belief that is also part of the Jewish story. Certainly the Declaration of Human Rights and the Refugee Convention is very much Jewish-inspired, inspired in a very sad way. They're a response to the Holocaust. But also, when I think about my own family history, I'm half Hungarian, and on my Hungarian side, my grandparents were saved by the two big people who saved many Hungarian Jews, Rudolf Kastner, a Jewish man who negotiated the lives of thousands of Jews, and Raoul Wallenberg, non-Jewish, who also saved thousands of Jews. And I really think that, particularly if I look at the Wallenberg example, diplomat from abroad could put his hands up and walk out. It was very inconvenient. And I think that engaging in justice, I think particularly has to be when it is not convenient. Because when it is convenient, it's not a challenge. But when it is a challenge, we need to see it as an opportunity to rise to it. And that's, I think, if we talk about the Jewish story, learning from the modern experience and taking that into our lives, I think is very much part of the ongoing Jewish story. And going back to the Israel part, I think Holocaust and modern Jewish history is very much part of the conversation. But the deep idea of things being inherently Jewish or social justice is not really there, in an almost sad way, because I think a lot of secular people in Israel have given the definition of Judaism over to more religious people, and it is certainly something that many Israelis can learn from diaspora communities and need to. But again, it's something that is a result of here it's growing up, even though in New York it might be a very big minority, it's still a minority. And as part of a minority, you find yourself looking and finding distinctiveness in a way that we don't in Israel have. And it is a blessing and a curse of being part of diaspora, and I think one that Israelis could learn from. Having said that, I'm talking about a very particular kind of Tel Aviv human rights bubble, which I know is not universal for the whole of Israel, and certainly in Jerusalem it's different.
I am
maybe
sitting
Meesh
on my
wants to-
hands, yeah.
Yeah.
It's not that I disagree with you entirely, but I teach the Pardes social justice track in Jerusalem on purpose, and I think that it's a class in Israel. My class is a class where we're using the state of Israel as a laboratory for Jewish texts, and what does it mean to be not just a state of Jews, but a Jewish state, and there's actually something very different about learning Jewish texts on whatever, refugees, and going out and seeing how the state of, maybe not doing such a great job, but there's something that's very powerful about using the state of Israel as a laboratory for Jewish texts, and I am very proud to be part of a number of rabbinic forums that are in Israel, working to make social justice really part of the agenda. It's true that it's surprise, not all of the Jews are into it, and certainly not all of the rabbis are into it, but I do think that that voice is out there and that voice is important, and I don't think we should surrender. And it's not surprising that wherever we are, there's going to be a voice of people that are interested in convenience, if you will, and can hide under sources that don't have to do with justice. But I'm not letting those people define Judaism for me. Nor am I letting them define the state of Israel for me.
Can I ask?
Yeah.
Can we do this? Okay. Meesh, this is the first time I've met you, and I feel like we have similar roles.
Yes.
Yeah. In what you just said, and you said, I teach at Pardes and social justice, but I can hear you're American. Do you think that is part of how you ended up who you are and where you are?
Of course my values are American.
Oh, sorry. I asked Meesh if this social justice, Jewish togetherness that she has also comes from her American identity.
Look, you're not the first person to try to dismiss me as a nice American. Not even close. But I will say that I participate in this forum called Beit Hillel. That's the biggest of the rabbinic forums. And I am not the furthest, not the most concerned with these issues of the people there, and I am certainly in the minority as an American, and I think that we ourselves, I live in Arnona, Talpiot, okay, South Jerusalem. There's a lot of Americans there, but I once went to a wedding, with my neighbor's wedding, and I was sitting with the neighbors, and they're Israeli, and I asked them out of curiosity, how many people have been to Baca? You feel like in Baca, what's the percentage of people speaking English? You think it's 50, 60, 70, right? So I asked them, how do they experience it? And they said, 90% Israeli, a smattering of Russians and a few French and an occasional American. And so what I think is you perceive that only the Americans are doing this because we by definition see each other more easily than we see Israelis. And it has been incredibly reassuring for me actually to be part of this forum. I'm not saying that Americans are not on the forefront of some of these debates. Baruch Hashem, I'm proud to be American and to bring those values that I think are beautiful values. But Americans are also on the extreme, on the other side. Very much so, and I am in a minority as an American wherever I am amongst rabbis.
If I can add just maybe one thing on that, which I think I experienced as someone who's most of my life overwhelmingly been here, but recently spent meaningful time, 2 years living in Tel Aviv. One of the things that feels to me, it goes back to a comment I suggested earlier about power playing a key role here. One of the things I often feel is at stake in some of these discussions is actually beyond the reality of power, people's self-perception of power drives a lot of their alignment around these questions. So I think a lot of American Jews, and again, I'm not even commenting on whether this is right or wrong, but a lot of American Jews who have a deeply universalist orientation to these questions intuitively feel completely secure, self-sufficient, and privileged in American society, such that there's something kind of grotesque to them about investing primarily or disproportionately internally to more parochial needs of the Jewish community, particularly ones that are more identity-based as opposed to basic rights, survival, et cetera. Going back to the sandwich, it feels like the Jewish options are more focused on chocolate milk as opposed to other people are still waiting for the piece of bread. And one of the things that I felt was actually kind of a fissure in Israeli society around this was the different groups taking different positions on should the asylum seekers be accepted and how should we relate to them as sort of a national priority. also kind of breaks down as to whether you fundamentally experience the current moment of Jewish Zionist reality as one of having secured independence, power, wealth, all kinds of things, and now it's time to start acting like a responsible power that has that bandwidth, as opposed to feeling like, no, like the smoke is still coming out of the gas chambers in Europe, and the state is maybe like a really effective bunker, but it's still a bunker. And I think you hear that in Netanyahu's rhetoric around this all the time. And by the way, I'm not even meaning to say it's disingenuous or even here to weigh in on whether it's wrong. It's not the way I am inclined, for the most part, to think about it, but it's more a comment of, I wonder if sometimes the real fundamental work, to the extent we want to affect people's priorities one way or the other, is about almost a prior category of how secure do you feel about yourself, such that then it's a question of where could you or ought you to sort of move more broadly. I don't know if you've experienced that in your work or the people you've encountered, but that ran deep for me.
Absolutely.
I want to pick up a little bit on the tools that we need to do this work, because as you were talking about Pardes's program, it's a program, you could have a program at Pardes that just studies what text has to say about social responsibility, and there are plenty of other programs in Israel, where a person can go and just volunteer. But this is a unique program, right, in that you're both studying what tradition has to say, and then you're going and enacting. What do the two lend to each other? What is to be gained from not just sitting in the yeshiva and studying, or not just being sort of in the trenches, quote unquote, doing the work of social justice? How do those two things speak to us? And I want to go back also to what you said, and I think this could, in my mind, this is related. Ethan, you said, you started to talk about the role of Shabbat. Mm-hmm. So what role does, and I've been thinking a lot about Shabbat in the context that we find ourselves right now in America, which is an absolutely relentless culture, right? Where the call to social justice could, talk about checking New York Times before you check your child, the call to just turn off for 25 hours. How do we do that? Why do we do that? What can Shabbat bring us in this moment? So I know that's sort of two questions in one,
right.
but I'm going to give them both to you, and you can.
Shabbat is a social justice practice. Okay, I'm just going to start with that, even though I should really want to answer the second. So Shabbat is the ultimate social justice practice. It's about finding humility, both seeing myself as God. God took a rest on the seventh day, and so I'm going to take a rest on the seventh day. And my slave has to take a rest. Okay, my slave has to take a rest on the seventh day, and therefore I have to take a rest on the seventh day. The idea that there's always more and more to do, and more to want, and we have to learn to let go. And my gosh, that's the worst thing about America. I'm sorry, that's the word. If like the best thing about Israel is learning to let go. It's not just about a lot of the evils of the world in this place in particular have to do with the thought we can always have more. We can always have more. Shabbat is probably one of the best social justice institutions that Judaism has to offer. To answer the first question second, to be honest, the Pardes social justice track is mostly study. Okay, it's everyone who goes to Pardes, whether they're in the social justice track or they're not in the social justice track, does community engagement, and we do that because it's a religious practice, the same as we hope that we don't coerce people to go to mincha, but we'd like for people to experiment with, to root their learning with action, and that's how you learn. And I've spoken a few times already about it over the course of this conference, not everyone, but about the danger of Torah being in the ivory tower. If Torah stays in the ivory tower and it doesn't interact with the world and it doesn't learn from the world, then it becomes lacking. Ultimately. So the goal of the social justice track really is to correct our Torah, right? In some ways, to enrich our Torah and to be in dialogue. It's really a laboratory. I think that word laboratory was not a wrong choice. And I mean, of course, there's something very powerful about having a laboratory of Judaism in the Jewish state. I mean, very powerful. But of course, it needs to be done wherever one is residing.
Yeah, I mean, at Hadar also from the beginning, even though a significant portion of what we do is focused on building a Beit Midrash, a place of study, and having people come in and learn in all kinds of ways, coming in for an evening lecture, for a week-long program. But from the beginning, students who have been full-time students and committed to not just being present, but sort of building the heart and the spine of the institution, have always had several hours a week spent on chesed, on being present for others in need. It's generally throughout most of the time it's been about visiting patients that suffer from Alzheimer's and dementia and learning how to be present for them. It's interesting your formulation of like what does it bring or what does it do. I think as much as we're a learning institution and as much as rabbinic sources powerfully and rightly laud the independent importance of learning, I think there's no question that any honest reading of the Torah understands that the core of the whole project is lishmor v'lasot, is to guard certain values and to put them into practice. And that's what it's all about. And we've always thought about and talked about the practical pieces of this as being not an effective addition, not an important balance, et cetera, et cetera. It is literally the culmination of the work, of the learning, to have it manifest in the world. This is true, I think, both as sort of a straight-up, analysis of what Torah stands for, but I think you also feel it when people intuitively get that. We actually just had a very powerful experience as an institution where the hotel that we were staying at, booked to stay at for our alumni conference, very late in the game, we kind of found out that there was the beginnings of a significant labor dispute, and the workers at the hotel had decided they had had enough with conditions that had deteriorated since we had last been there, and were beginning a drive to organize. And the question kind of emerged, and it took us like a couple days to kind of even figure out how do we respond here. But I would say in retrospect, what emerged clearly was this was an arena where we had some power and influence. There was something, we could play some kind of a role. And we ended up as a larger community in all kinds of different ways, raising our voice about this, actually meeting with the workers in the hotel, offering them support on the eve of their unionization vote, and being very present with them, such that by the time that it came time for our alumni conference, the workers had actually overwhelmingly unionized. And in a way that was like very moving to me, but very surprising, when one of the workers who we asked to address the group on Friday night, basically during the spot where we were in our prayer services together, afterwards I went over just to shake her hand and thank her for coming. And she said to me, "I will never forget that you guys were here and stood with us." And I was thinking to myself, what did we do? Like, what did we do? I showed up to this, we lent our voice, but simply the being present was unbelievably important and impactful. And one of the things that was sort of also important for me to see as an educator was how many students were so moved by a vision of what it looked like to translate certain basic values of Torah and looking out for the worker and everything starting from verses down to rabbinic sources into reality. It made it real. And I think we know this from like the ritual sphere, which is you don't just like sit around and like study Kiddush, right? Like you might study that, but then the actual like really powerful moment is when you pick up a cup of wine and say these quasi-magical words and like create sanctity in time and drink it and feel it in your body. And it's an amazing thing when you are able to do that with the parts of Torah that are about what it is to create a society that works a certain way. So in that sense, I think, yeah, the language I would want is how do we have our learning culminate in the kind of action it's intended to lead us towards. And when you get the opportunity to do that, it's an amazing experience.
So my last question was going to be just as small as my first question, which was, how do we define success in the world of social justice? And I think in some ways, Meesh and Ethan, you have just answered that. So I want to turn to you, Tamara, and say, what does success look like in this realm? And I want to complicate this a little bit. What does it look like? You know, you're working in Tel Aviv. That is a different context, we know, than Jerusalem. It's certainly a different context than the United States. So what does it look like in a secular context, right? Where Shabbat feels a little different, perhaps, for instance, in Tel Aviv than it does in Jerusalem. So how do we define success? Do we define success as we lishmord and now we're lasoting? Is that what the success looks like? What does it look like? Is it even important to define it?
Okay. When I think about human rights and social justice work, I think there's two essential parts that need to be looked at. One is service and one is justice. In the terms of whatever it is, community organizing, social workers, asylum seeker issues, there's dealing with the immediate and there's dealing with the source of the problems. It's not enough to feed the homeless. It has to also be looking at what are the root causes of homelessness. And I think that it is very achievable to feed the homeless. And it's something that needs to be done, and it's good. But that's an easy success. The more difficult part is changing the root cause of homelessness. So I know in my work, I can talk about a lot of individual cases where we are releasing individuals from detention and helping individuals. Our biggest challenge is policy change, and that's really, really hard, but we can't give up. That's a luxury. Giving up is a luxury. And I guess in my work, because we are an organization that both works very much on the ground in terms of helping the individuals and also advocacy and policy change, we see both directions. So we work on the policy change, and then we see when it really affects the individuals. And I can tell you that small policy changes, when I will describe them, will sound really small, but when you see them in real lives, they are really significant. So we've had a lot of success in policy change. The particular issue that I work on, it goes back and forth of policy changes back and forth, but really when you see policy change, or whether it's the root cause of homelessness or whether it's discrimination, etc., I think that's success of doing justice work more than just service work.
I think it's really beautiful that you, in some ways, just brought us back to the story of creation, because I think your answer is how I think about the story of creation, that God creates the world and we become God's partners in creation. So what does success look like in the realm of social justice? Of course, we know that to save a single life is to save an entire world. So we're not free to desist from feeding the hungry, from going to visit those in asylum detention. But when we truly become God's partners in creation, we recreate a world. We restore the world to God's vision of wholeness and of justice. And if we come back to that creation story and ask about, what happens on day 9, day 10, day 11, what is our role? It's to restore the wholeness of the world that comes after Shabbat. So I want to thank our panelists for answering my questions. You all got to hear what I'm curious about.